A totalitarian state. Putin's Russia increasingly begins to resemble Hitler's Third Reich and North Korea. Russia is finally turning into an empire of evil with a totalitarian ideology.
No Putin, no Russia.
With a cult of war and a hunt for everyone disloyal to the regime. With total surveillance and the gradual stripping of Russians of any rights. How did the Russian Federation finally shift from authoritarianism to tyranny? Why does Putin's regime now dictate to every citizen not only what to do, but even what to think? Why has the country been plunged into an atmosphere of fear where people are forced to deify the leader? Watch the special report, Facing Totalitarianism, How Putin is Turning Russians into Servants of the State. This book, and the films based on it, send shivers down the spine. Horrifying scenes. They depict what has already happened, such as in Nazi Germany. And at the same time, what could still happen in the future. Totalitarianism in its purest form. People like zombies, brainwashed, total control, and the absolute power of a dictator. All of this is about George Orwell's novel 1984, a masterpiece, recognized worldwide, already a classic. But in the Russian Federation, it was recently removed from the school curriculum. Libraries across the country are seizing the book from their collections. Bookstores are pulling it from their shelves, even though it was once a bestseller. A Russian, Dmitry Salin, decided to simply hand out copies of Orwell's books for free to people on the street. For that, he was prosecuted under criminal charges. Why? Researchers of totalitarianism are certain the order came from the Kremlin to erase the book from memory, because the scenes from Orwell's novel are frighteningly similar to today's Russian reality. The complete absence of freedom. It is not people who decide what can be said, read, or even thought. It is the regime. In Orwell's novel, there was the concept of thought crime. In that totalitarian society, a person could be punished brutally for a careless thought, gesture, or word. And now deputies of the Russian State Duma are openly talking about making thought crime punishable in Russia, after passing yet another repressive law.
A literal interpretation of what is written. It means punishment for attempting, among other things, thought crime. There's one author who uses that term. So, we are proposing punishment for thought crime.
The deputy is referring to a law that criminalizes searching for information on the internet, if the authorities deem that information extremist. Now, in Russia, anyone can be declared a criminal simply for typing something unwelcome to the authorities into Google or Yandex. This list of so-called extremist materials is enormous, and it grows constantly, every day. Articles, music, films, anything at all.
Anyone searching for something online is now in a risk zone. This is absolute totalitarianism. This is not just authoritarianism. It is another step toward totalitarianism.
The main goal here is to intimidate people. Now, no one knows what will bring punishment and what won't. The mere desire to read or watch something outside of Putin's propaganda can be interpreted as a violation of the new law, even if the person never posted anything online, never called for action.
But in your own head, you have already committed something unrighteous. The very thought itself becomes criminal. References to Orwell in this context are not an exaggeration.
Authorities are shutting down access to independent websites. They are creating their own internal system, the so-called sovereign internet, isolated from the outside world. Social networks are being banned one after another. Telegram and WhatsApp calls are being blocked because the FSB cannot eavesdrop on them. Instead, the Kremlin is preparing to forcibly move Russians onto a state messenger, MAX. Fully controlled by the security services, it has already been dubbed a cop in your pocket. Everything you write or read there is visible and recorded by repressive agencies.
All of this together, legal decisions and technological measures, form what can only be called digital totalitarianism. They are deliberately constructing this digital totalitarianism, together with IT company leadership, together with the FSB.
Researchers of totalitarianism argue Russia now fully meets the scientific definition of a totalitarian state. And the key marker here is complete control over every individual's life. Freedom is slavery. That was a slogan in Orwell's totalitarian state. Russian officials are gradually preparing their own citizens for the loss of all rights and freedoms, sometimes quoting Orwell's lines almost verbatim.
What is a right? That is the greatest lack of freedom. I can tell you this, the more rights we have, the less free we are. Prohibition itself is the greatest freedom of man.
Prohibition truly does free you from the burden of thinking independently or making decisions. And prohibitions are multiplying. Over the past 3 years, the State Duma has issued a record number of them. They banned all critical statements about the war. For so-called discrediting the Russian army, people are thrown behind bars. Any criticism of the authorities leads to being branded as a foreign agent. Afterward, such people are banned from teaching or doing business. Under the strictest ban, spreading criticism, satire, or memes about Putin, ministers, deputies, or security officials. For this, up to 5 years in prison. You cannot criticize, not only online or at public gatherings, but even in private conversations, in a cafe, or at home in the kitchen. This is not yet formally written into law, but in practice, people are already being punished. This is what happened to this woman. Olesya Ovchinnikova, a resident of Krasnodar, and her husband. They were having lunch at the local restaurant Na Drovak and discussed between themselves the so-called special military operation. They criticized Russia's aggression against Ukraine. A person at the next table overheard them. He called the police. The couple was thrown to the floor and handcuffed. The woman was fined, and her husband arrested for 15 days. Both were warned, if they continue protesting that Putin launched an aggressive war, that is, if they commit a repeat offense, they face up to 15 years in prison. A Russian citizen, Sergei Klokov, was sentenced to 7 years in prison. For nothing more than a phone call, he spoke to a friend about the situation in Ukraine. It turned out the security services were listening. According to transcripts of the recording, which became material evidence in court, Sergei uttered these phrases: "We are told we are fighting fascism, but there is no fascism there. None." He also said to his friend, Russia had no right to attack and start a war. Russia is a murderer state. All of it, true, and all of it, spoken not at a rally, not posted on social media, just a private telephone conversation. But for this, a man was sent to prison for 7 years. In authoritarian states, people can be punished for public criticism of the authorities, but not for words spoken in a private circle. That is where it ends. A totalitarian regime, however, throws a person in prison for any statement unwelcome to the authorities, even if spoken in confidence to a relative, a friend, or a colleague. Putin's Russia has already crossed that line. That is why the state encourages denunciations.
There are things you simply cannot say out loud, or more than that, things you cannot even mention, because an atmosphere of denunciations has taken hold. Denunciations now function exactly as they once did in older totalitarian systems. No one can feel safe in such a system.
The authorities themselves call on people everywhere to seek out enemies, those who disagree with the Kremlin's course. Putin labels them national traitors, claiming they must be eradicated.
I am convinced such natural and necessary self-purification of society will only strengthen our country.
Conspiracy mania, enemies everywhere, is another obligatory slogan of a totalitarian state. Putin, as a seasoned KGB officer, understands this well.
There must always be an enemy whose existence justifies the need for force and expansion, an enemy that also ensures internal control. When there is an enemy, everyone must rally around the leader.
All of this Putin said about Western countries, yet somehow he failed to notice he was describing not the EU or the US, but modern-day Russia. Big Brother is watching you. Another line from Orwell's novel. And indeed, in Russia, the state attempts to track all social media posts, all messages and messengers, even with the help of artificial intelligence. Even officials themselves are being monitored.
The FSB and other Russian security agencies are actively eavesdropping on the entire bureaucracy. It is total surveillance. Every governor, every deputy governor, every department head, they all know they are being listened to, whether selectively or continuously. They are always monitored. And more than that, they live in constant fear, knowing they may be caught at any moment, sometimes not even by the state itself, but by their own colleagues, eager to denounce them for disloyalty.
An atmosphere of fear is one of the core attributes of a totalitarian society, and Putin is doing everything to ensure people are afraid. All people, both officials and ordinary citizens. Mass protests, held at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, were brutally dispersed. Security forces detain individuals even at solitary pickets, even if the sign simply says, "My grandfather fought against fascism," or "Orwell wrote a dystopia, not a manual." But for the Kremlin, Orwell's dystopian nightmare appears to be exactly that, a manual for action. In Russia, everything is unfolding just as in that book. The screws are being tightened. For criticism of the Kremlin and its war, thousands of criminal cases have been opened. People are being imprisoned en masse. For example, Moscow City Duma deputy Alexei Gorinov was sentenced to 7 years in prison for nothing more than speaking about the failures of the Russian army on the battlefield. Another illustrative case, single father Alexei Moskalyov. The man was imprisoned because his daughter drew an anti-war picture during class. In the penal colony, Alexei was beaten. There are countless such examples. Russians are afraid. Many are already morally broken. Even when asked about punishments for searching for information unwelcome to the authorities online, or about the imposition of the state messenger Max, most show total helplessness.
It's grim. But what can we do? It's not for us to decide. The elite decides.
Dissent is already branded as treason to the totalitarian regime. People must feel their own insignificance, hopelessness, and inability to change anything. Only then are they ready to obey any order from above. That is how Putin's Russia functions. Sometimes it descends into sheer absurdity. Teachers in the Voronezh region received a letter, allegedly from the ruling party United Russia, ordering them to make a helmet of the fatherland from foil as protection against NATO satellites and to film the process. The teachers complied.
This is an important patriotic act. Let our hats become a symbol of unity.
It turned out to be a prank. The order was not sent by United Russia, but by prankster Vladislav Bohan. He wanted to prove that Russia is a totalitarian country, and that its citizens are willing to obey any order from the authorities, no matter how absurd or humiliating. The Voronezh Regional Ministry of Education proved its own loyalty to the totalitarian system. Learning what had happened, it praised the teachers, essentially for their slavish obedience, and only then mildly scolded them for lack of vigilance.
On one hand, the teachers once again demonstrated high executiveness. On the other, it was disappointing, of course, that they could not distinguish a genuine party initiative from an inappropriate joke.
Russia is no longer just an authoritarian state. That is the conclusion of historian and academic Yuri Pivovarov. He left the country, and unlike his colleagues, can now speak openly, without fear of repression.
I call the current regime in Russia neo-totalitarian. We've already passed the stage of authoritarianism and moved straight into the dead end of totalitarianism. I use the term neo-totalitarian. Neo, because it's a different era, a different time, different people. Totalitarian, because it fits the very nature of totalitarianism.
Russia seeks total control. For the Kremlin, it is no longer enough to suppress opposition sentiment or monopolize political power. A totalitarian regime demands much more. The word means full total control over every sphere of public and private life. Culture, education, leisure, even intimacy, even sex. Everything must be regulated, watched, directed. And the frightening truth is that Russia is already moving in that direction. The government, for example, has drafted lists of toys allowed in kindergartens, those that do not contradict so-called traditional values. And Russian school primers are, to begin with, quotations from Putin himself.
Allow me to ask you, dear Vladimir Vladimirovich, to address every first grader on the first page of future primers.
The Kremlin also wants Russian women to bear as many children as possible. Putin speaks about this almost every time he takes the stage.
7 or 8 children. A large family should become the norm.
For this purpose, the government has already created a so-called demographic special forces.
This must become a matter of state. Such a demographic special forces unit has been created in every ministry, every department. This sphere now covers business and universities. We are returning to a measure of success defined by the number of children.
Officials now repeat Putin's call to increase birth rates at every level.
We need 51% of families to be large families.
In other words, it is practically a duty for Russians.
That is exactly how our president, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, defined it. We must achieve this goal and fulfill this task.
Many already approach the issue of demography as if it were about breeding rabbits. Not citizens, but organisms that belong entirely to the state, expected to reproduce on command.
There is only one formula. A man must work, a woman must give birth.
The role of a woman is either to be pregnant, or nursing, or preparing for her next pregnancy.
There is no other way. We must push forward. Population sounds ugly, but we must develop.
Even the Russian Orthodox Church joins this chorus.
Who will fight if there are no births?
The Russian Orthodox Church has finally abandoned Christian values and become part of the propaganda machine of the totalitarian state. Like the officials, priests insult women who refuse to carry out the will of the leader.
The time has come when women no longer give birth. They've become weak, cowardly, immoral, and they don't want to bear children.
And anyone who dares publicly say they reject these demands, who states they don't want children in such a state, can be prosecuted under a law banning the propaganda of childlessness. Russia now has such a law. In this, Putin's Russia has even outdone Hitler's totalitarian Germany.
The question of whether to have children or not is mine, my wife's, my parents'. It is a private matter. Under authoritarianism, the authorities don't care about such things. Under totalitarianism, the authorities intrude even there. They literally climb into people's beds, into every family, dictating what is right and what is wrong.
In Russia, films that contradict so-called traditional values have been banned. Instead, theaters are obliged to show films glorifying the war against Ukraine. Books are banned. Plays are canceled. Directors, playwrights, and writers are prosecuted. Everything that does not fit into Putin's ideology is being erased. Every totalitarian regime requires its own dominant ideology, mandatory for all. Putin builds his on historical myths of a so-called special Russian civilization, nostalgia for the USSR, and the claim that Russia alone defeated fascism. Therefore, it has the right to decide the fate of other nations. Kremlin-linked political scientists are working to codify this ideology into a new Russian code.
The Russian code is a new code of the builder of communism, new commandments from God.
But leading scholars of totalitarianism describe Putin's ideology differently, as schizophrenic fascism. Fascism disguised as a struggle against fascism, a fractured worldview, a dangerous, aggressive caricature of fascism.
In essence, fascists are calling others fascists. Ideologues of the Russian world, like Alexander Dugin, even openly call themselves fascists. Yet in Russian reality, it pays to accuse the West of fascism instead. This schizo-fascism works. It fabricates enemies who must be destroyed.
This ideology justifies aggression, not only the war against Ukraine, but wars the regime intends to wage against other countries. Conflict with the collective West.
Another defining feature of totalitarianism, the cult of personality. It has long been cultivated in Russia. Putin's ideologue Dugin churns out slogans like,
Putin is everywhere. Putin is everything. Putin is absolute. Putin is irreplaceable.
Officials of every rank echo the same.
No Putin, no Russia.
It has become mandatory. Fail to show loyalty, and you are branded an enemy.
All this means you must constantly praise Putin. Once doing your job was enough. Now you have to stress your loyalty every time.
Public sector workers, teachers, students, they are bussed in en masse to rallies in support of the dictator. Even private business owners force employees to attend pseudo-patriotic flash mobs. The atmosphere, the slogans, even the gestures, they all echo rallies of Hitler's National Socialist Party. Putin's handlers also stage fake meetings with the people, busing in carefully chosen actors so he can step out of his car and greet them on the street. Pavlik Morozov was a fetish of Soviet propaganda, a boy who informed on his own father. And so today, Pavel Morozov and other hand-picked supporters chant, people are used as props for propaganda stunts. They are lined up to form giant slogans. In Rostov region, children were even put on their knees to spell out the dictator's surname. And it works. Horrified educators who left Russia but still keep in touch with parents confirm it.
A crying woman from St. Petersburg told me about her nephew. He had just started first grade, and by spring he was already repeating phrases about Jew Banderites, about killing Ukrainians, about how Putin is a great president. Through tears, she asked, what should she do? He is only 7. This is not unusual. It is happening everywhere. If a child is forced to kneel with others to form a giant letter Z, or made to hold Putin's portrait, there is no way it won't leave a mark. I've had tens of thousands of conversations like this, and with every single one, I understand with horror. There is no way around it. Children at that tender age will not escape. They will carry it with them.
In Russia, propaganda clips are filmed where children in military uniforms sing about dying for Putin without hesitation when Uncle Vlad gives the order. And in Orwell's novel about the horrors of totalitarianism, there were many such children's songs.
We are the children, builders of the future, and we the children.
The final hallmark of totalitarianism, the cult of war. Russia matches it 100%. War is in every Putin speech. Propaganda is saturated with it. War is glorified everywhere, from kindergartens to churches. In Orwell's novel, the slogan was, "War is peace." In Putin's Russia, officials say,
War is love. War is a friend. War is the future. Let this stay in our memories, and we must pass it on to the next generations.
Today, there are not that many countries in the world with a totalitarian regime. North Korea, Eritrea, Afghanistan. And with all of them, Putin's Russia actively cooperates, while also learning from their experience. Kremlin propagandist Skabeyeva traveled to North Korea and filmed reports. The main message was clear: we should live like the North Koreans. After all, supposedly there is nothing wrong with totalitarianism.
They look to the bright future with confidence. In North Korea, stepping outside without a badge featuring the great leaders is forbidden.
Skabeyeva tried to convince viewers that there is at least some freedom in the DPRK, saying, for example, that they were allowed to film in the streets. But in her later reports, she was forced to admit with irritation that guards followed her every step.
We were immediately banned from filming here, and locals were told not to record anything either.
Because in reality, locals live on the brink of hunger, intimidated and brainwashed. This is what those who managed to escape the prison camp country say. The same was shown in dozens of undercover reports, shot on hidden phones by tourists, including some of Skabeyeva's own Russian colleagues. But now it is no longer acceptable to talk about this. Skabeyeva shows fake residential districts where nobody actually lives.
The dear leader of North Korea inaugurates a new street
And tells Russians that they should follow the North Koreans' example, eat less and work more.
One North Korean tiler works for two, sometimes 2.5 Russians.
But in fact, labor efficiency in such a totalitarian state is very low. This is what Russian director Vitaly Mansky says, who filmed a documentary about North Korea.
In North Korea, slave labor is used. Only here, the slave owner is the state itself.
And Putin is gradually turning Russians into slaves too, step by step, ban after ban, quietly. Just like the frog does not notice that it is being boiled if placed in a pot of water that is slowly heated from warm to boiling. But there is still a difference between Russians and North Koreans.
In North Korea, this is already not the first generation that has accepted their country as a given. They were born into these conditions, into an environment of absolute isolation, an absolute vacuum. For them, it is the only possible reality, the only life they can even imagine. But Russia is different. Russia lost its freedom, its dignity, its right to exist in the civilized world by itself. Russians, with their own hands, step by step, deprive themselves of even the most basic human rights.
When the previous North Korean dictator Kim Jong-il died, people wept en masse, as loudly and as theatrically as possible. Those who did not cry convincingly enough were repressed. But for many, the tears were in some sense real. This is how crowd psychology works. When everyone around you is crying, each individual person, sobbing within that crowd, on a subconscious level starts to believe they are crying sincerely. And the same is true of mass rallies, flash mobs for Putin. People herded there, forced to chant. At some point begin to believe that Putin really is their leader, that they must give up freedom, give up their rights and human dignity, and be ready to carry out any order. Each year that Putin stays in power, more and more people will have their minds clouded this way, as long as Russia remains a totalitarian state. And this is a problem not only for Russians themselves, not only for Ukraine, which fights against Putin's aggression.
This political system is developing in the worst and most dangerous direction. Dangerous for global peace and security. The Baltic countries are under threat. Scandinavia, Sweden, the entire Arctic basin, the Baltic Sea.
Russia may attack Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, Poland, and Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Armenia also feel threatened. Anyone living next to such an unhinged totalitarian regime is sitting on a powder keg. For the past 2 decades, Russia was an authoritarian country. Putin and his loyalists in key positions sought to control political life, built a vertical of corruption, and enriched themselves. But after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia crossed into totalitarianism. Russians are being systematically stripped of their last civil rights. The Kremlin demands total control, absolute power over every individual life. Now Putin is trying to cement his role as a totalitarian dictator, becoming Russia's Kim Jong-un. Russians are being turned into cogs in the system, expendable material. And the only thing that can save them from this fate is the fall of Putin's regime. Maxim Orlapov, Special Report.